Our session for today is called Podcast for Language Teachers, Supercharge Your Professional Development with Maris Hawkins and Stacey Margarita Johnson. So my name is Maris Hawkins, and I teach now elementary and middle school Spanish at an independent school in Washington, D.C., and I live right outside in Alexandria, Virginia.
And my name is Stacey Margarita Johnson, and I teach at a university, and I work in the Center for Teaching at Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee. And that picture there you see on the screen in between us is the first time we met face-to-face at ACTFL in Washington, D.C. last year, after more than 2 years of working together on the podcast and collaborating really intensely on a lot of projects. We finally got to hug. Such a beautiful moment.
And I think people were surprised that we hadn't met each other before too.
I mean, we do like a weekly podcast, a weekly newsletter, and we've just been doing it all remotely, which is kind of a testament to how great online networks can be.
So at this beginning, we want you to take a minute to pause and reflect and think about how you typically engage in professional development. It might have looked different as we've had to social distance, but in a typical year, do you read blogs or articles, or are you attending more conferences? And so what does your typical professional development look like?
So what is a podcast? For those of you who aren't already obsessed with lots of different podcasts like Maris and I are, a podcast is a recorded audio file. It's usually free to listen to. It's available on the internet or on a podcast app. I like to call them podcatchers, like Stitcher or iTunes or the Google Podcast app. If you have an iPhone, it probably came with an Apple Podcast app already on the phone that you might not even realize is there, but you could be listening to podcasts right now. Also, podcasts often have sponsors who play commercials to pay for the labor of the people involved, but some podcasts have no sponsors and do so either with corporate sponsorship or through volunteers.
And so we wanted to highlight some world language podcasts that we've listened to. Obviously, the one that we listen to the most is We Teach Languages. But then there is Inspired Proficiency, What in the World Language Podcast, the hashtag MFL Twitterati podcast, and Language Latte as well. And I think one thing that we were saying is so nice is the fact that many times some of the guests that we have also been on other podcasts. And so that way people can listen to them multiple times on different topics.
Yeah, and it's created a nice little network. If you like a topic, you can hear different people's perspectives on that topic across different podcasts. So I enjoy that there's a growing collection of world language podcasts. So professional development for language teachers is not simple. I really like this tweet from Chris Cashman on Twitter. He says, language teachers have to divide their studies, or PD, up among a lot of areas: educational trends, language teaching, linguistics, history of culture of target language, current events in the cultures they teach, pop culture, and also maintaining our own proficiency. It can be a lot. It can be a lot to think about, and it can be a lot to fit into a busy teacher's schedule.
I agree. And I think given the wide range, it's sometimes hard to narrow down. So almost as a follow-up question to our first question, you can also think about, where do you typically spend your time with professional development? A spoiler alert for this, I think for me, that's been one good thing for the We Teach Languages podcast, is it's opened my eyes to some of these topics that I hadn't thought about before.
So I'm going to just frame what the tips that we're going to give you about using podcasts for professional development around the experiential learning cycle. And this is something that I use to think about all learning. I use it to organize my language teaching. I use it to organize professional development. I use it to monitor my own professional development. And if you're interested in learning more about it, I actually talked more about it on episode 133 of the podcast, all about the experiential learning cycle. But basically, we start with having some sort of an experience. We reflect on that experience and connect it to our own experiences, our own other experiences. We draw abstract conclusions and connect it to other knowledge. And then we actively experiment with what we've learned and see how it will work for us. Podcasts are especially useful for providing concrete experience that is different from the experiences we gain in our own classrooms, and for helping us make abstract connections, abstract conceptualizations of knowledge based on what other people know and are experts in, knowledge that maybe we don't have access to. So if you are interested in thinking about how is this helping me grow? How is it helping me develop my expertise? Thinking about podcasts is something that will provide you useful experiences, give you an opportunity to reflect on them, help you to connect it to abstract concepts and expert knowledge, and then give you an opportunity to experiment with something new in your practice. That's really what our tips are centered around in this presentation.
And I think for me, some of the things I might have heard of before, but sometimes it takes me multiple times of hearing something and being exposed to something for it to kind of click into how I can specifically use it in my classroom.
That's great. And I think that's why we think of this experiential learning as a cycle also, because every time you go through the cycle, maybe you glean something. But multiple times through the cycle with the same topic will actually lead to deeper results. John Dewey in the early 20th century is an really important educational theorist from the early 20th century. And he said, all education is experience, but not all experience is equally educational. And I think that a lot of us go through life sort of experiencing a lot of things, but not really taking the time to reflect on them, to connect them with our other knowledge, and then to actively experiment. And so that's where some intentionality on our part is necessary to make sure we're not just having the experience and letting it flow on past us, but to really stop and work on all 4 steps of this process.
And so I think this leads right into our first tip. So tip number 1 is to learn about the research-based pedagogy. And many of the podcast episodes have interviewed various scholars about the research that they're doing. And then it allows us to think about how we would use that research in our own teaching settings. So episode 138 was Integrated Performance Assessments, a review of literature and the steps to move forward with Stephanie Madison. And in that episode, Stephanie really talks about how she was using the IPA and how she used it in her class, but also the research that she found as she was working towards her PhD. Episode 111 was Teaching Listening with Gianfranco Conti, and he talks about how he has done research and written a whole book on how to teach listening, which I think he mentions as well, but we don't always talk about as world language teachers. So this is a 2-part episode where he really delves into what he found when he was studying it, and then also practical tips as well. And then episode 136, Speaking Blackness in Brazil, Identity and Investment with Uju Anya, where she discusses addressing race in the language class and also how she did her research as a professor of Portuguese.
Sorry, Maris, why don't you go ahead and take tip 2 also?
Okay, Tip 2 is to learn about what is working in other classrooms. So one of my favorite things about We Teach Languages is when the kind of catchphrase of listen to real teachers. And many teachers have been interviewed about what they're doing in their own classrooms. And this just always sparks many ideas for me as well. So we have episode 127, Diverse Images of Spanish Speakers and Reaching Reluctant Learners with Rhoda Nunez Donley, where she talks about how she makes sure to include students' voices and just to make sure that we're not focusing on traditional Eurocentric images. Episode 134, 1 Year of Biblical Hebrew. And in that episode, a professor talks about how he is doing this, making his class CI with biblical Hebrew and for comprehensible input, and how he makes sure that his students are really engaged in that process. And then episode 121, Collaborating to Build a Content-Based Language Program with Glenn Barnes-Carroll and Maggie Broner. And that was also a 2-part episode. But again, how many teachers are moving away from focusing so much on grammar, and then how to start working with your colleagues in order to develop more of a content-based language program.
One thing I love about the people that we're looking at on the screen right now is all 3 of these people are people I got to interview, and they represent radically different contexts in different places in the country, doing different kinds of work with different kinds of students, higher ed and K-12, just such different contexts. But in each of these 3 interviews, I really got a peek inside of their classrooms and got to see what life is like for them, and was able to take away really meaningful lessons that I could immediately apply in my own language classroom. And I know listeners generally only listen to the episodes once. I edit all the episodes, so I listen to them 20, 30 more times, so many times. And I can almost say that in some ways I've almost memorized the episodes by the time I'm through editing them. And these 3 in particular have been 3 episodes that have really made a difference in my teaching. So it's one of my favorite benefits of the podcast.
I agree. And I think recently I had a chance to do that with listening to an episode multiple times, and you really do get a lot out of it. And I was thinking this summer, I'm really focusing on the diverse images of Spanish speakers. And one of the things on my to-do list is to go back to listen to some earlier episodes as well, and go back and really access that bank.
Oh, that's fantastic. And that's the great thing about podcasts is once you create them, put them on the internet, they're just there for people to use whenever it's convenient for them, even if it's a long time down the road. So tip 3, learn about language programs in other contexts. So we were saying this about classroom practice, but one of the cool things about listening to podcasts is there are people in other countries. There are people who teach languages that are very different from yours. Here's an example, episode 71, Indigenous Language Preservation and Revitalization. Aliana Parker talked about Canada's efforts, and specifically British Columbia's efforts, to revitalize their incredible number of, to preserve and revitalize their incredible number of Indigenous languages. This is not a topic that I had known a lot about before We Teach Languages, and so I'm just really grateful I've gotten to learn about Indigenous language preservation and revitalization through this. Also, I do not work at a language center, and so episode 117, the language center's role on campus and in the community, with Angelica Kramer, was really interesting to see how language labs are different than they used to be, how they function in a college campus, and what their role is. In episode 124, Julie Glosson and Cheyenne Staten talked about teaching languages to students with disabilities. And this is a context that I know a little bit about accessibility from a teacher's perspective, but I learned so much from them about how to really ensure that all students, from their research and their practice, and just the context that they teach in, that's very focused on IEPs and other things that I wasn't as familiar with. So that was a great episode. And episode 129, Language Policy and Innovation in Scotland, I had no idea. I mean, why would I know what language policy is like in Scotland, right? And my conversation with Lynn Jones and Louise White, who both work in that area in Scotland, was just revelatory and really gave me some vision for what US language education could become based on the success that they have had in Scotland.
And then another big part of the podcast is afterwards, Stacey helps compile episode notes. And so many times if someone references a book or an article, Stacey will add that to the episode notes, which are on the website. And so because of that, I started following a lot of people, because if they have a Twitter handle, they'll list that. And so, for example, I started following Lynn Jones, and again, then I'm seeing even more about what language learning looks like in Scotland. So you can continue to take it to kind of the next level to continue if it's a topic that you're interested in.
That's such a great point. It really, when you listen to the episodes, follow the show notes, follow the people on Twitter or on social media, or look up their blogs, you're expanding your network in sort of permanent ways moving forward. You can't go back to pre-knowing about Scotland time of your life. Now you just have that information and have those folks in your network.
So the next tip is tip 4, reflect with your PLC or your professional learning community. And so this is another way that you can really reflect on what is going on. So the first tip's kind of centered on what the podcast is and what it looks like. And this is how you can take it on yourself to take it the next step. So each time we have a new podcast episode, we put out a newsletter. And many times people will write in with their own thoughts. Sometimes it's via Twitter, and other times it's through Facebook, and we'll highlight those as well. In this particular newsletter, this was right after Stephanie's episode on IPAs. And so We Teach Languages ask a question, what are some difficulties that you can have implementing IPAs? What are some challenges? And so you can then read what people wrote. Then they also have reactions to the past episodes as well. Many people will just give their thoughts about other episodes, which is always, again, interesting to read and know. Then we also have a Facebook page, and many times people will go there as well to share their takeaways and how they're implementing ideas from the podcast into their classroom and what it has made them think of.
Yeah, I get so much joy out of seeing people's reactions, follow-up questions for the original guests, or thoughts about challenges they might face, or questions about the value of something, or thinking about how they can extend their practice. Some of my favorite online conversations have been reactions to episodes. And so I look forward to even growing this part where we spend more time in conversation with each other online.
And I think too, so since, as we said, so many of these guests are online, it's easy to loop them in to answer the questions as well that people have.
All right. Another tip is to share episodes with your professional learning community or your department. So there are 2 episodes in particular that we think would be really useful as sort of, if you're going to share an episode with your department, this would be like starter episodes that get a department hooked. There's many more that we would recommend. Maybe we'll write a blog post about that at some point. Episode 93, Moving Towards Proficiency, Rebecca Blue Wolf interviewed Kara Parker and Megan Smith about what it takes to go from more traditional teaching techniques to focusing on proficiency. And they give some really concrete ideas about how that typically happens and what you can do to make sure your department's all on the same page. It's a really uplifting episode, but it's also an actionable episode. It's the kind that you could share with your department and maybe start a conversation about what are your hopes and expectations for your curriculum, for your students. Another one is episode 101, in which Thomas Sauer interviews, I can't even name all the people he interviewed because it was a whole department. It was everyone in that picture, plus a couple more, I think. He interviewed a whole department headed by Katrina Griffin on their approach to collaborative planning, where they actually plan not just their curriculum, but their lessons together as a group. It is a remarkable system and will definitely give your department food for thought.
And so my my former department did this. And I did this at my current school as well. Because I've listened to so many episodes, if something would come up before our in a meeting, I would say, okay, let's all listen to this episode, and then the next meeting, let's meet and discuss it. And I think it was able to bring more voices into our own department as well. And the other thing that I would point out is that PEARLL, out of the University of Maryland, produces transcripts for all of the episodes. And I've always found, I listen when I'm driving. So it's always nice to go back to the transcripts, or if you're using them in meetings, to use the transcript to reference.
Yes, I'm so grateful to PEARLL for just coming along beside us. They produce the transcripts and host them on their own website, but there's a link to it on our webpage if you need to find them. And there's often a link to the transcripts in the episodes as well. But there are going to be people who tell you they don't want to listen to podcasts. They're not going to listen to a podcast, and that is okay, because everything in the podcast is also available in transcript form. So you don't have to be a podcast listener to get the benefit, which is just awesome.
And then our last tip is tip 6, and that is to contribute yourself to the podcast. One thing that I have particularly loved about We Teach Languages is how much we are able to include other people and other voices on the podcast. And so many times teachers have and other participants have taken upon themselves to interview a lot of people. So for example, one person is Dory Conlon-Perugini, who's done a ton of amazing episodes.
Like most of my favorite episodes, actually. She interviewed us. Gonna put this little tidbit out there. I'm sorry to interrupt you, Maris. I have had sort of my academic hero since I started doing research on intercultural competence and transformative learning. And he's someone who, I would sort of over-reference him, and my advisors would have to say, you can tone down the references to Michael Byram. Probably just cite him once or twice, and then maybe not cite him every sentence you say. So I just have loved Michael Byram for years and years. And one day Dory just interviewed him, just interviewed my academic hero, and just gave me this amazing interview with someone I'd admired for years. So it's really cool that it occurred to her to do something like that. It would never have occurred to me to email Michael Byram. So just so grateful for all the contributors who have brought so many new voices and people I have admired and learned from so much into the podcast. Sorry to interrupt you.
No, I agree 100%. And so one of the most recent episodes that we have aired is episode 142. So that's just to let you know what number we're up to. And that was an interview with Jonathan Rosa, and it was phenomenal. This is the episode that I listened to twice because a Facebook group was holding a Facebook Live where we all talked about it as well, which is another way that you can reflect and contribute on using that platform. And then Janina Hansen went to a workshop with Justin Slocum Bailey and interviewed him in episode 113. And this was for about how to use your mind, body, and voice skills. And it was another just great episode. And obviously different people bring such different perspectives, which is the value of honoring everyone's voice. Finally, not everyone has to be a podcaster. If you are not interested in interviewing people, that's fine, but we would love to feature some more blog posts. And so this is one blog post that was episode recommendations from Carmen, where she just highlighted some of the episodes that were meaningful for her. You could think about making some strands. What are some general takeaways that you've noticed throughout the episodes? Or what are ways that you're applying what you've heard in your classroom? So again, that completes the cycle of really reflecting on what you're listening to. And again, though, because we have 142 episodes, it's amazing, but that can be daunting as well. So if someone can read, someone's post about how some proficiency-based episodes that were really meaningful for them, I think that's wonderful. And that will help people give a way to start. Another thing that we will do is we will put links to all of these episodes that we have discussed throughout our session. And so it's an easy kind of starter kit for people who are new to We Teach Languages.
I love that, Maris. I often worry that people don't know where to get started, because starting with a brand new podcast and they have 142 episodes and dozens of newsletters and blog posts, I worry that people they're just gonna start with the most recent episode and move forward and not go back and see all of those treasures that have built up over time. And so these blog posts for me are so meaningful, because they give people that easy access, that easy entryway to some of the real gems that are in those previous 142 episodes. So I appreciate you mentioning that.
So I think this wraps up our session on the podcast We Teach Languages, and ways that you can incorporate it into your own professional development. And so hopefully this will be a springboard for you to not only listen to We Teach Languages, but hopefully a lot of the other podcasts that we mentioned as well.
Yes, thank you so much for participating in this virtual session. And Maris, thank you for all your hard work on the podcast and putting this session together.
It was fun.